I'm David Hazard, founder and director of Ascent, an international prep school for authors. We serve clients in the United States, Africa, Asia, and Europe, and you can find us on the web at itsyourlifebethere.com. Today, I'm here to talk with one of our clients, Lane Dolly, the author of a brilliant historical novel. Lane, it is so good to be here with you today, and I have to say, your book has informed me in so many ways about pieces of what we might call forgotten or even unknown history about the United States, hidden histories. I mean, you're writing about a young woman who goes from upstate New York into the Native American territories after the Trail of Tears. I had no idea whatsoever what happened to the Native American people when they were moved from the north down into the south, had to resettle, establish their own schools, their own life all over again. Had no idea about the work of the mission organizations that went in to help them, the pressures that were on these people, whether or not to assimilate or not assimilate. You have done an incredible service for us by giving us this piece of American history that I'll bet most people do not know about. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you for having me here, and I'm really glad to be able to talk about it because I loved writing my book, and I even loved researching it more.
Well, that shows all over the place because you did incredible research to bring us an amazing depth and quality of facts. And you've created a very winning and interesting, compelling character to walk us through these events. Tell me, what was it that inspired you to write this book?
Two things, really. I discovered a mystery and then a secret. The mystery was a hole in my family tree. I became interested in finding out, who did I come from? What were they like? Where were they from? Why am I from Oklahoma? Why am I not from somewhere else? And I began looking, and I began doing the research and found that no one in my family living knew a thing about the woman I researched for my book.
And she is?
Her name is Harriet Ann Hattie Sheldon, a woman from Utica, New York, from a very nice, ordinary family, and she chose to leave that behind. She became educated but then restless. She wanted to do something different with her life. She broke with tradition. She went against the grain.
And what year are we talking about here? What period of time?
She was born in 1833, and after she was educated and became bored with traditional life, she didn't want to embroider. She didn't want to get married and be ordinary, so she left in 1856. She left Utica, New York, and went to teach in Indian Territory among the Cherokees.
And how long was that journey? How far did she have to travel? And how did she get there?
She traveled somewhere between 1,300 and 1,600 miles, as I can best estimate anyway. And I believe she came down the Erie Canal and then down the Mississippi. I had to do a lot of extensive research about what it was like when the water was low, and it added a little drama to my book to have to retrace her steps at one point. Then it was by wagon all the way through the state of Missouri, a little bit into Kansas, and then down into the territory designated for the Native Americans, Indian Territory, in what became Oklahoma.
I see. And how old was she when she went on this journey?
I think she was about 23 years old. She was young, but she was restless, and she obviously had to have something on her mind because she made application. She wasn't just selected by the missionary organization, she made application. It was called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. Foreign. Indian Territory was considered foreign.
And so at 23 years old, she had more than just a restlessness. She obviously had some kind of spark and drive that would take her from the comforts, relative comforts of the 1830s and well-settled central New York into very rugged, unsettled Native American territory in those days.
From what I learned, we call it today racial tension. In her era, it was the scourge of slavery and the injustice of the Indian removals. And she had discovered a great deal of family history when she went to college, what we call college, in Massachusetts. And that drove her, as did her family's abolitionist background. She wanted to set the story straight. She wanted to help the peoples who were misunderstood and abused.
Now, her family was involved in abolition?
Yes, her father had even run for office, and so her father ran for a ward seat in Utica on the abolitionist ticket. And I found it fascinating to go back and find out how the Underground Railroad had gone through the state of New York and how many people came through Utica on their way to Canada and freedom.
And so she was a young woman with very high ideals about what we would today call human rights, the rights of slaves, and apparently the rights of the native people, and a desire to go help them. As you were researching this book, were there any unusual discoveries that you came across?
My research took me from the Houghton Library at Harvard to the Library of Congress to the University of Tulsa to the University of Oklahoma. There are many, many archives. If I had to pinpoint one single thing about what shocked me, it is the fact that even in my history, I wasn't taught that many of the Native Americans who were moved to Indian Territory had slaves.
Can you tell us briefly, I know that this is a long saga, but can you tell us briefly what your story is about?
It's about an educated but restless young woman who decides to leave behind convention, and she travels the very, very long, dangerous journey to Indian Territory to teach among the Cherokees, discovering when she gets there that it was a divided tribe, and there was a great deal of unrest, a lot of violence. She also discovered that in the region, it was a pass-through region for every kind of whiskey seller or prostitute or fur trader at an area where the Arkansas River converged with two others. It was next to the slave state of Arkansas, and it was just above the great efforts that had just taken place after the Mexican War in Texas.
So she goes to this territory, and what was her mission? What did she do when she got there?
She wanted to teach what we call elementary age children, and it was a small mission school at a mission that had been begun by a very famous missionary. And I began to learn more about him as I read his many, many letters in the library at Harvard. He had gone to prison for the Cherokees before removal to Indian Territory because he wanted to remain loyal to them. And when gold was discovered on the land that the Cherokees owned in Georgia, the government wanted him to be loyal to Georgia.
So she gets to Native American territory. She's this young woman. She's very idealistic. And in the story, and in truth, in fact, what she finds is all kinds of divisions between the mission groups, between the Native Americans themselves. Tell us a little bit about what were the crosshairs that she found herself in all over the place when she arrived there with her ideal to just teach Native American children.
It was a pretty raw and wild place, and there were many people who wanted to help them. But what she found was the Cherokees were a divided tribe because there were many members of the tribe who had intermarried with whites and who had had children and had had the opportunity for education. There was another side of the tribe that didn't like those changes, that wanted to keep with the old ways. And so she found herself in the middle of a great divide. And the issue over removal had caused tremendous battles within the tribe because certain people had negotiated a treaty. The other side was very angry over it. When the Senate approved it, there were reprisal murders after the tribe was moved to Indian Territory.
Mm-hmm. So she walks into a really divided Native American sentiments, obviously. What about the mission groups? What did she discover when she arrived at the mission in Park Hill about what was happening between the mission groups?
So many different groups were there. The Methodists, the Moravians, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, the Catholics, and the Mormons. And she came upon a Baptist minister just down the road, a Welshman actually, who was very driven to help the full-blood Indians. And the town in which she had been hired to work, it just turned out, that's where many of the mixed bloods lived. And those two groups didn't get along. The missionary that we're speaking of who hired her, Reverend Samuel Austin Worcester, was a linguist who was translating the Bible. But the Baptist down the road wanted to do it as well. And he didn't have the same amount of education. And so those two versions of the Bible in my book created a lot of confusion for the Cherokees.
And so she found, competition among the missionaries for adherence to their churches, to their missions.
I think that what she discovered was that they were only human as well. In the correspondence that I read of Reverend Worcester's up at Harvard, it was rather heartbreaking to see that the missionaries so wanted to do good, but they were under the auspices of a board in Boston, and all of their directives came by mail, really slowly. And so he had to wait, and he had to explain everything. The letters were so incredibly long and painful, and everything played out very slowly there. And yes, wanted to be loyal, but it wasn't always possible.
Well, and so, what emerges for me reading your novel is that even the missionaries were there with their tasks to do, their vision of what they wanted to accomplish, but they were there on the ground among the people, and the governing boards were thousands of, or at least 1,000, if not 1,600 miles away, who didn't understand the realities. And I think that's what strikes me most about your book is here's this young woman, Hattie, who goes again with her ideals in hand. And not only does she find a setting in which there's a great deal of division to challenge her, but then she falls in love with someone. What happened to the real Hattie and to the Hattie in your book?
The real Hattie, from her abolitionist family in Utica, met a young man from just across the border in Arkansas, whose family had fled South Carolina and had established a little town there. And this young man had come over to work in Indian Territory. And they met only for her to discover that his family tradition was the opposite of hers. His family owned slaves, not necessarily by choice, but because when they left South Carolina, the man's mother's father insisted, you can't go without these people who raised you. So she was terribly compromised when she found out what was going on in the family, the Latta family, after she fell in love with James Latta.
And so James Latta was
employed after teaching himself. He was employed by a man named George Merle, who was a merchant and a landowner, a white man who had married into the Cherokee tribe and had moved to Indian Territory and established a beautiful home. That is still there. It's Oklahoma's only existing antebellum mansion, and he had slaves, and James Latta was hired as his slave driver.
So here's this young woman, comes from an abolitionist family, wants to do well, do good, and see to live out her ideals. She goes and finds things are not as black and white as she thought. She walks into a gray situation and then falls in love with a man who's a slave driver. How did that play out with her family?
It was a very, very difficult situation for her to come to understand that James Latta's family hadn't necessarily chosen to own slaves, that James Latta's father believed slavery must and would end, and he'd begun to educate his slaves, which was against the law in Indian Territory. This situation played out very uncomfortably in my book, as Hattie felt she must be honest with her family, she must tell the truth, she must communicate, which was only by mail, and so she revealed some, but not enough. And there came about a great misunderstanding between her parents and her over who she was seeing, and it was quite an uncomfortable thing.
So what I love about your writing is the historical accuracy, the depth of information, and the fact that we've got this very human young woman who has to confront her ideals, rather, are confronted by reality. And the reality that the person that she's fallen in love with is a slave driver, but There's something really different and unusual about James's role, James Latta's role, what he reveals to her about that transitional period. What do we learn from James Latta about people who had to deal with slaves during that time of history?
We learn from the Latta family that their faith was very important to them. And they were Christian people, and they believed that just as Hattie's father did, that all men are created equal. And so the clash came in the fact that the religious beliefs were interpreted different ways. One way by people in the South who had slaves, another way by people in the North who didn't believe in having slaves. And Hattie was caught within that, as was James Latta, and trying to find their way out as there were rumors that war was coming.
And so James was really in the role of trying to help blacks who were owned to develop and grow so that when their freedom came, they could actually be ready to handle freedom, since many of them were several generations of families who had no responsibility, no financial responsibilities, no understanding of how to live in the world. And here is James from a slave-owning family in this transitional period trying to help people learn and grow so they can know how to handle freedom. And here's Hattie coming in with black and white ideals that anyone who owns slaves must be bad. It's a wonderful setup, Lane. You have done a wonderful job dramatically of presenting this struggle between ideals and people who have to grow through these struggles. In my almost 35 years now of coaching writers, I have found that most writers, while they're working on their project, they also go through something of a personal growth, some changes. Did you find that to be true for yourself?
I found that I was discovering people who had moved beyond the boundaries of what was expected. In her case, she chose the unknown. She didn't want an ordinary life. And I think that was passed down because I saw it in every generation of my family leading up to me. Push beyond. Do something different. Find out more. And I think that's what was confirmed for me, and that's what encourages and energizes me for the next chapters of my life.
Well, I have to say, as a historical novelist, you are the quintessential researcher. I have watched you these many months as you've written your book go to incredible lengths to do great research so that your book is historically accurate, and at the same time creates a personal drama involving some very compelling characters. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you for commenting on that, because that was one of my greatest joys. But I was also blessed because I found things. I think there are researchers who don't, and I was just very lucky to find my relatives in many letters and books.
If there's one thing that you could leave with your readers about this book, what is it that you want to leave them with?
The power of courage, the power of doing something to help other people, following up on a belief that you have, and then when the going gets very, very rough and dangerous and maybe even deadly, sticking to it, staying with it through to the end.
An incredible story, wonderful theme, great characters. Lane, I want to thank you very much for being here with me today.
Thank you.
I'm David Hazard. I've been talking with Lane Dolly today. I'm also the founding director of Ascent, a prep school for authors. If you need help developing a book, if you need creative services designing a book, you can find us on the web at itsyourlifebethere.com.